U.S. We know U.S. had always had a hate boner for Venezuela because ever since Hugo Chavez came to power and trying to assert Venezuelan sovereignty, U.S. always had a hate boner against the government in Venezuela. But why did they decide to crank up that aggression up to 11 at this particular juncture?
Yeah, well, look back at the first Cold War, Cold War One, and the U.S. recognized that it could not wage a direct war with the Soviet Union, so it went around trying to destabilize any potential allies of the Soviet Union to try to encircle the Soviet Union and weaken it. The same strategy now, right? So the US is going after China's allies and partners, trying to weaken and destabilize them in order to try to isolate China. We see this certainly in the Asia Pacific region, like with the Philippines being a classic example. The previous Philippine president, Duterte, was much more pro China. He's now being, going through this kangaroo court, which is completely absurd. The current extremely corrupt oligarch leader of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, the son, he's, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the US-backed dictator who was a brutal dictator. He ruled with an iron fist, killed thousands of people in the Philippines. He was a key US ally in the first Cold War. His son now is another US proxy, and he's allowing the US to establish new military bases in the northern part of the Philippines with offensive missile systems aimed at the Chinese mainland that can hit most major cities in the Chinese mainland, as far as Chongqing. And that's where you're from. I mean, it's crazy. Over 2,000 kilometers in these missile systems called the Typhoon missile systems. So, I mean, the U.S. is trying to, in every country surrounding China, India, which is it's not very successful there, in Southeast Asia, certainly with Japan and South Korea, it's trying to encircle China. And then it's going to other regions and trying to destabilize China-friendly governments. Obviously, probably the closest ally of China or partner of China in Latin America is Venezuela. And of course, Venezuela has very large oil reserves. I mean, I always point out when we're doing geopolitical analysis, it's never just one reason, right? Like, for instance, the war in Iraq was not just about oil, but ignoring the oil factor is, of course, also very naive. Like, there's a multitude of factors here. In the case of Venezuela, well, let me start with Latin America in general, then I'll get to Venezuela. So the U.S. strategy, again, I've talked about how the U.S. recognizes that in the short term, it can't continue to escalate too much against China without causing more backlash, more blowback on the U.S. So they need to find ways to decouple and ways to provide opportunities for more escalation in the medium term against China. So right now, the strategy is solidifying U.S. hegemony across the entire Western Hemisphere. This is the neo-colonial or the old school colonial Monroe Doctrine, which is a 202-year-old colonial doctrine that essentially says that all of Latin America and all of the Western Hemisphere is part of the U.S. imperial sphere of influence. And the U.S. empire should control everything that happens in this region. And specifically, the Monroe Doctrine was very insidious because, the U.S. has always been a clever empire. Unlike the traditional European empires, which were proud of the fact they were an empire, they boasted of it. The British Empire boasted that it was so big that there was always a part of the empire where the sun was rising. The sun never set in the British Empire. Whereas the US has always been an empire that claims not to be an empire, right? So the Monroe Doctrine originally was the US empire as it was beginning to establish itself and expanding territorially, not only to the West by stealing the land of indigenous Americans, Native Americans, but also moving to the South. So the Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823. In 1846, the U.S. invaded Mexico in an illegal war of aggression, and they colonized the northern half of Mexico, which, by the way, are today some of the areas with the largest oil reserves and natural resource reserves, including two of the biggest states in the U.S. economy, California and Texas, which were part of Mexico, stolen from Mexico. So as the U.S. declared the so-called Monroe Doctrine, it was territorially expanding its empire, and it was a clever colonial strategy because the U.S. said, we're going to protect these independent republics in Latin America who just earned their independence from Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. We're going to protect them. Of course, that's absurd. The US was not protecting them. It was replacing the Spanish and the Portuguese colonialists as the new colonialists. And today, actually, the Monroe Doctrine is kind of cited in a very similar way. The US says, we're protecting the region from China and Russia and Iran and their nefarious meddling. And the US says China and Russia cannot meddle in Latin America. Only we can meddle in Latin America, right? So this is the strategy. And then, of course, resources are part of this, but it's also kind of just more solidifying this entire geographic region and also preventing any of these countries from being potential Chinese allies if there is a future war with China, right? So, like, for instance, if there's a war with China, Venezuela would probably allow Chinese or Russian forces to use Venezuelan territory, right? So the U.S. is trying to solidify imperial control over the entire region. Now, in terms of Greenland, which is the Panama Canal is obvious. Trump wants to colonize that, and this is for trade. Clearly, he says China controls it. It's not true. China does not control the Panama Canal. There were some Chinese companies that were invested in ports on different sides of the canal, but they were not run by China. They were not run by the Chinese government, certainly. And Trump is trying to force it's actually a Hong Kong company, but it's still Chinese. Trump was trying to force this Hong Kong company to divest from its investments in Panama, and instead, BlackRock was going to buy them up. And when Trump announced this in Congress, he conveniently didn't mention which company it was, BlackRock. He said a U.S. company bought it. Anyway, so, Panama is very important in terms of international trade, and he wants to block that off to China, but also Greenland. Greenland is important, one, because it has a lot of critical minerals that the U.S. wants to replace its dependence on China for critical minerals in the supply chain. And as climate change leads to, rising global temperatures, it's going to start to melt some of the ice in the Arctic, and it's going to make it easier for ships to go through the Arctic and near Greenland. So the U.S. already has a military base in Greenland. They want to colonize it, militarize it further, and exploit its critical minerals. So these issues are all related to kind of preparation, strengthening the U.S. empire, strengthening its control over key commodities, natural resources, critical minerals, to make its own kind of supply chain within Latin America. And another part of this, by the way, is exploiting cheap labor in Latin America, because the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. Trump says that, but they're not going to do that realistically in the U.S. It's not going to happen. We're actually seeing the number of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. falling under Trump. And so what they're going to have to do realistically is friend-shore. A lot of that's going to Mexico, but they want to send it also to other parts of Latin America. They want to send it to like Argentina, Chile, maybe Ecuador, although Ecuador is becoming a failed state under these U.S. puppet leaders, where they can pay people, 1/5 of what U.S. workers would be paid, even less. And yet these would be U.S. companies. I mean, doing what they did to China, but the difference is they're going to make sure that there are these puppet governments that are these complete neoliberal libertarians like Javier Milei in Argentina, who are going to end all state support, end all industrial policy. Argentina is deindustrializing very rapidly as we speak. So they'll invest and try to make Teslas in Argentina or something. And then the Argentine government's never going to actually have planning and industrial policy to develop competitors to Tesla like China did. So they'll just keep these countries trapped in like the lower part of the supply chain. So they just want to recreate this entire region and use it as a base of operations as they prepare and try to strengthen the U.S. for more confrontation with China. Now, where does Venezuela fit in this? Obviously, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves. I mean, the U.S., by the way, is the world's largest producer and exporter of oil. This is a huge change in the past 10 years, one of the biggest geopolitical shifts. The U.S. produces more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia, and that figure has only increased. It massively increased under Obama. He boasted about this. It increased under Trump in his first term. It increased under Biden. And the U.S. is now the biggest producer of natural gas and a major exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is now going to Europe because they're not buying cheap pipeline gas from Russia. So it's not like the US needs Venezuela's oil, but of course, US corporations would love to exploit Venezuela's oil. They've been trying for many decades after it was nationalized. And then if they can control the oil reserves in Venezuela, they would definitely go after Colombia and Trinidad and Tobago. They already basically at this point are controlling, like, I mean, the US threats in the Caribbean. It's not only against Venezuela, they're threatening Caribbean countries. So, and then Brazil is kind of the last domino to fall in this US imperial strategy. Brazil is a major oil producer, it's a major ally of China, it's a founding member of BRICS. So, I mean, the Americas, from North to South America, all the way down, all of the resources in this region are off the charts. Some of the biggest oil producers in the world, the US, Canada, Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago as also gas producer, Venezuela, Brazil, natural gas producers. It's crazy. Gold. So that's the US strategy. And then also to starve China of those resources. Venezuela is a major ally of China. And of course, the vast majority of Venezuela's oil exports go to China. Now, China can probably do without Venezuela. Venezuela only produces around 1 million barrels of oil per day. But, the idea is for the entire Americas to try to prevent the Americas to reduce all of its trade with China. China still actually has a lot of trade with Brazil. Brazil's largest trading partner by far is China. And China imports a lot of iron ore from Brazil and oil and also soybeans and beef. And this is true for South America in general. The largest trading partner of South America is China. And the largest trading partner of all of Latin America, excluding Mexico, is China. And that relationship is increasing over time. Many Latin American countries are joining the Belt and Road Initiative. And the largest port in largest port in Latin America just opened, which is the port of Chancay in Peru, which it was invested heavily by China. It's a joint Peruvian-Chinese port, but the major Chinese, well, it was built by Chinese state-owned construction companies, and one of the main operators is Costco, not to be confused with Costco, like the U.S. company. Costco is the Chinese state-owned shipping giant. So Latin America is becoming more important for China's trade, and Latin America in the past few decades has become more and more independent of the US empire. So the US strategy is to try to solidify more control, and this would also be a threat to other countries in the global south, especially Africa, saying you cannot have close relations with China. We're in a new Cold War. We're not going to allow you to be non-aligned. The US is going to try to force countries to say you have to pick a side. You're either with us or against us, as George Bush said. And Venezuela is this country that, first of all, again, given all the resources, it would be very strategic, but also symbolically, it would be a massive blow to, first of all, the entire Latin American left. If Venezuela falls, almost certainly Cuba will fall. And then the US would probably also try to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And then any other left-wing government in Latin America would be immediately threatened. Brazil is the real prize, but that's much more difficult. They tried to do that by imprisoning Lula on fake charges in 2018 and putting Bolsonaro in power. But, Brazil has been able to, Lula has been very clever, and they were able to, take action against Bolsonaro because of the coup attempt and all of this. But, I mean, the strategy is to go to these different regions, to weaken all of the independent countries that are Chinese allies, to destabilize them, to impose hegemonic control, and then to send a message to other countries that they'll be next to try to isolate China.
Well, thank you for connecting all the dots. I can just sit here and listen to you for hours. I'm just asking you to speculate now. Given the current U.S. military buildup in the region, particularly in the Caribbean, do you think there's a realistic chance for U.S. military action against Venezuela, or is this just an act of bluffing? It's Trump just trying to intimidate some kind of regime change to take place in Venezuela by flexing U.S. military muscles?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's the $1 billion question. No one knows exactly what the strategy is. Trump loves to do this kind of madman strategy like Richard Nixon, but I honestly think that it's likely that, yes, there will be further U.S. military action and escalation. I mean, the first thing I'll say to your question is there already is U.S. military action. The U.S. has already killed dozens of Venezuelans and some Colombians and Trinidadians in these strikes in the Caribbean. And of course, this is completely bogus. This idea that it's because of drug trafficking, totally false. This is the new WMD's narrative, the weapons of mass destruction lie that the US used to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq. We know that was false. Now, what they're saying falsely is that Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, is the head of a so called drug cartel that they call the Carta de los Soles, the Suns cartel, because the Venezuelan military has like a sun patch on their uniform. Totally absurd. First of all, even mainstream analysts in Western think tanks funded by Western governments have admitted that this so-called Suns cartel does not exist. It was made up. It's being pushed by the Trump administration and the far-right Venezuelan opposition, which is backed by the U.S., led by these people like Maria Corina Machado, this far-right extremist who is very pro-war, and yet she won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, along with war criminals like Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama, and the CIA asset the Dalai Lama and other U.S. government-funded operatives. So she is working with Marco Rubio very closely to try to justify more and more military attacks in Venezuela. Now, during Trump's first term, let's not forget, Trump launched another coup attempt in Venezuela, and this was using this puppet, Juan Guaido. And in fact, I remember, Carl, that I've been to Venezuela several times. I remember one time I interviewed you in Venezuela. We were talking about China and Venezuela relations in 2019 during that coup attempt. So that was, a lot of people were scared, obviously, that it failed, but a lot of people in Venezuela were very scared that there would be a U.S. invasion. And Marco Rubio was pushing for a U.S. invasion at that time. Also, I should point out, I have an article about this on my website, geopoliticaleconomy.com, that Trump's defense secretary, Mark Esper, a former VP of Raytheon turned defense secretary, now he would be known as Secretary of War, more appropriately. Mark Esper, after he left the first Trump administration, he wrote a memoir, and in it, he admitted that they talked about military attacks on Venezuela. They discussed potential options, including of an invasion, including missile strikes or airstrikes. They didn't do the airstrikes, but let's not forget there was an attempted invasion of Venezuela backed by the Trump administration that people jokingly called Bay of Piglets. This was in May 2020. It was called Operation Gideon, and it was led by U.S. Special Operations Forces, Green Berets from the U.S. Army, allegedly former Green Berets, but I mean, come on. And they trained these forces, these mercenaries, Colombian and Venezuelan mercenaries in northern Colombia, and then they took a boat into Venezuela and tried to invade, but they were actually caught by a union of left-wing Venezuelan fishermen who supported the government, and they informed the authorities, and the authorities found these mercenaries and arrested them. And this was overseen by this U.S. mercenary company based in Florida called Silver Corps, which was owned by another U.S. Special Operations Forces official named Jordan Goudreau, who was then screwed over by the Trump administration. What happens is when you work for the CIA like this and your operation fails, they abandon you. I mean, we've seen this so many times throughout history, right? They throw you under the bus, and the CIA said, "Oh, we don't know who this guy is. We have nothing to do with him." And he faced all these legal issues, and then he tried to sue the Trump administration because he was like, he admitted, we were going to Florida and meeting with Trump administration officials. We were working with the CIA, and then it all failed, and they just abandoned us and pretend like they had no idea who we were. This is the idea of, plausible deniability. So the reason I mention all that history is that, we've seen this story before, right? What they're doing is they recognize that the first time it failed, so they just need to go straight to the military option, which is why I do think we're going to see further escalation of the military attacks, especially now that, Marco Rubio is not officially in the first Trump administration. He had Trump's ear as an advisor, but now Marco Rubio is the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Donald Trump himself. Rubio is the second person in U.S. history to simultaneously serve as both the Secretary of State the head of foreign policy, that is, and the head of the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor. The only other person in US history who simultaneously held both positions was Henry Kissinger. And look how powerful Kissinger was in the Nixon administration. So Marco Rubio is obsessed with this. This is his lifelong mission. This is like his entire career has been dedicated to overthrowing the Cuban government and then the Venezuelan government. And then after that, the Nicaraguan government. Like, he's from Miami, Florida. This is like, if he can pull this off, he will be the next US president, because like Florida will just like, they will worship Marco Rubio in Florida. In Miami, like there will be, everything will be named after him. They will have statues on every corner of Marco Rubio if he can pull this off. I don't think he'll pull it off, but he thinks he can. Like, he's not going to lose this opportunity. So the question is, what will they do? I don't think that Trump will agree to send troops, at least large numbers of troops. I think he would agree to send special operations forces. He's already admitted to authorizing CIA covert operations. Now, come on. The idea that the CIA was not already active in Venezuela is absurd. The Venezuelan government has released a lot of evidence in recent years of, they've arrested these like random CIA operatives. Or at least the Venezuelan government said they were CIA operatives, and they've released some pretty strong evidence. Like, for instance, targeting Venezuelan infrastructure, trying to blow up Venezuelan power plants and oil fields. This has happened many times in recent years. So the CIA has obviously been active in Venezuela. But as part of this psychological war on Venezuela, Trump publicly confirmed that he authorized the CIA to carry out lethal operations, hinting, of course, they're going to try to assassinate President Maduro. So that's part of the psychological war, but I don't think that's going to work over. Like, the Venezuelan government has already faced so many obstacles, so many attacks, so many threats. The psychological war element's not going to work. But if the U.S. launches airstrikes or missile strikes and bombs military targets, bombs oil fields, like, that could actually cause serious chaos in Venezuela. And potentially the U.S. would like to push Venezuela into a civil war. So I am very concerned. I mean, as someone like, I've been to Venezuela many times. I have a lot of friends there. Like, it's a beautiful country, a beautiful culture. Like, I'm very concerned. They've already suffered so much under these illegal U.S. sanctions and a blockade. The U.S. just wants to destabilize it and cause chaos and to lead to overthrow of the government. I mean, if you go back to 1960, the U.S. State Department published an internal cable, which has now been declassified, about the U.S. strategy in Cuba. And it admitted, this was a year after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and a top U.S. State Department official admitted that the Cuban revolutionary government led by Fidel Castro with, Ernesto Che Guevara was extremely popular. The majority of people supported it. They admitted, the State Department admitted this. Therefore, they concluded that the only way to destabilize it would be to cause extreme economic suffering. As Nixon and Kissinger famously said, when Chile elected a socialist president, democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, they said, we must make the economy scream. Well, a decade before, in 1960, the U.S. State Department said the strategy should be to collapse the economy. And this is the exact quote. They said, quote, bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government, end quote. That's from the State Department. That's the strategy for Cuba, to destroy the Cuban economy, bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow government. It's the same thing in Venezuela. And that strategy has been going on for over a decade. It's failed. So now they're at the last resort, which is the military option. I mentioned that I don't think like a full-on invasion with thousands of troops is likely, but I actually do think airstrikes or missile strikes in Venezuelan territory are likely. And the New York Times has reported, interviewing people in the Trump administration, that is being very strongly considered. They say that there are three scenarios. One, according to the New York Times, interviewing Trump administration officials. One is that the strategy is using special operations forces, sending in teams to try to go in and kidnap and or kill Maduro. The other strategy is to send in troops to seize Venezuelan strategic infrastructure, including oil fields. They admitted that. So the U.S. troops would be literally occupying Venezuela's oil fields like they did in Syria. And the other option would be not as direct, but launch attacks and then try to target the Venezuelan military, to force the Venezuelan military to say it will no longer protect President Maduro, to force Maduro to flee to another country. But I mean, I think that's a pie in the sky idea. So I'm very concerned about what will happen in Venezuela. Last thing I'll say is that, I did an interview with a Chinese media outlet about this, and they asked me, they said, if you were forced to put a number to it, like what percentage likelihood do you think is of these outcomes? I said, well, if I were at gunpoint forced to pick a number, I would say, a 66% likelihood that there are like missile strikes or some kind of strikes directly in Venezuelan territory, not just in waters surrounding Venezuela. I mean, that's pretty likely, but there's still a 1/3 possibility it doesn't happen and that it's all bluffing. But then I said if I were forced to say like maybe 25% likelihood of an actual invasion with US troops, I do not think that's likely. But there's so much, like, Marco Rubio, he wants to be president. Like, let's be real. JD Vance wants to be president. I think actually Rubio is more likely to be president than Vance. And Vance, I mean, and Rubio, as evil as he is and Machiavellian, he's actually scarier to me than even Trump. Rubio is much smarter and he's cunning and he's a lifelong neoconservative war hawk, crazy hawk. He supported every war, and yet he's kind of rebranded himself as like a populist Republican, right? And he's actually popular among many Democrats, which is crazy. When Marco Rubio had his Senate confirmation hearing, it was 99 people voted in support of Marco Rubio. 99 voted. So like, so many Democrats are okay with Marco Rubio because he's seen as like this supposedly more moderate Republican because he's an old school neocon. And like, he wants to be president. And like, if he can pull this off, he will be the next US president. So there's no way that he's going to pass up this opportunity. He's going to do everything he can to accelerate the war in Venezuela.
That is a very, very concerning development. Thank you for making your time to talk to us. And this is an evolving story, so I'm sure I'm going to have you back on the show to further explore this topic. The US-China competition is not going away. And it's just manifesting differently. Ben, if people want to follow your work, where would they go?
Yeah, just geopoliticaleconomy.com. And I want to thank you for having me, Carl. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for letting me rant about this stuff. I'll add one other quick note here. You use the term US-China competition, and I'm not criticizing you in any way. That's the term most people use. But, we're in a new Cold War, Cold War II. And it's really sad. I wish that weren't true. But I will say that, even some people here in Beijing, they have acknowledged this. I mean, like I talked to a lot of Chinese academics here who are influential. In China, universities are more influential than in the US, where the government just ignores academics. But here, the Chinese government, they actually take the advice of experts very seriously. And I've talked to some high-profile Chinese intellectuals, academics at top universities, and several of them have said, yeah, we're in a new Cold War. Although I remember one said to me, I won't name him, but he said, I prefer the term Cold War II because this Cold War is very different from Cold War I. So calling it a new Cold War makes it kind of seem like it's similar to the old Cold War. He says it seems very different, but there's a sense of kind of pessimism about US-China relations. And most people have recognized that the best they can do is minimize the harm and try to reduce the speed of escalation of tensions. But in the long term, things will only get worse, which means that, unfortunately, I think, for the several decades that come in our lifetime, the next 40, 50 years, I think it's going to be a time of a lot of geopolitical conflict and more, unfortunately, I think we'll see even more and more kind of violent conflicts like during the first Cold War. So unfortunately, what we're talking about with Venezuela and all of this is, in my view, probably the beginning of a very dangerous moment in history.
Thank you for that very important clarification, because sometimes when people say U.S.-China competition, it almost seems China is like an equal participant in precipitating this confrontation, but actually it's a U.S.-led, U.S.-imposed Cold War 2.0. This is a confrontation that China does not want. Like President Xi Jinping said many times, the world is big enough for both U.S. and China to coexist. But that's not the mentality of the elite in Washington, because they only believe in the zero-sum competition. That means, for U.S. to be on the top or continue to rise, the other people must be pushed down. And this is why they're taking the tongue near heart approach of competition, try to kneecap everybody. But yeah, this is it is what it is. And again, I have to say thank you for making your time. I can geek out on this for hours. I'll just be quiet, turn off my mic, and listen to you. It's very elucidating on many of the topics, especially how you connect all the dots. So thank you again, Ben, for making the time to speak to my audience. And for the people watching, thank you. And until next time, bye-bye.